Okay, welcome everybody to the third of Reclaim Holloway's series of panel discussions at the London Festival of Architecture. These discussions are centred around the planned women's building on the site of the former Holloway Prison, and they're designed to raise awareness about the current status of the development and to hear from architects, activists and academics on pressing questions of design, legacy and the potential of the site before the plans are formally submitted for planning. Tonight, we're focusing on the theme of therapeutic architecture, considering the needs of the women who will use the building and what role architecture can play in creating a safe and healing environment. My name is Rachel Shoiga. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Kent, and I've been a member of Reclaim Holloway since just after the prison's closure in 2016. Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by Niki Gibbs, who is an artist, a member of Reclaim Holloway, and also a board member of Community Plan for Holloway. We're also joined by Professor Yvonne Jewkes from the University of Bath, with Nisha Kurian from We Made That Architects, and also from Kate Paradine from Women in Prison. So before we begin the conversation, I'm just going to introduce the structure of the event and do some quick housekeeping. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to our campaign and women's imprisonment, where the current development of the Holloway site stands, and explain what Reclaim Holloway have in mind when advocating for a women's building on the site. Then each of our speakers will have about 5 minutes or so to introduce themselves and to offer some reflections. I'll then pose a few more questions on the potential of the building as a therapeutic space and to think about the role of architecture and community engagement in facilitating healing. And we'll hope to keep at least 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end. So as questions come to you, please pop them in the chat so that I can collect them and pose them to the speakers in the final section of the event. The event, as you will have heard, is being recorded, and our artist, who is also our speaker tonight, Niki Gibbs, will be drawing the conversation from that recording. So please make sure to follow us on Twitter to see Niki's incredible illustrations of ideas from our last 2 sessions on legacy and on feminist architecture, and from the one that emerges from tonight's conversation as well. So because we've taken quite a restrictive approach in terms of participation, it's very unlikely that we will be Zoom bombed. But if it does happen, we will end the meeting, taking a few minutes to check on the speakers. And if the speakers are happy to continue, the meeting will reopen and the session can continue. Okay, so to introduce the event and to give a little bit of background about Reclaim Holloway, we are an abolitionist coalition. We're made up of women with experience of Holloway, women's sector work. When the prison closed in 2016 and this public land went up for sale, we mobilised to make sure that the development is socially just and serves the public, and to advocate for an appropriate and meaningful legacy for the prison and for the thousands of women who were imprisoned there since 1852. Holloway Prison's history encapsulates the notion in feminist academic literature that women are subject to both care and control through criminal justice institutions. It was a place of punishment where women were held in austere and inadequate conditions and separated from loved ones and their lives. Rates of self-harm are shockingly high for women in prison, and imprisonment can both cause and exacerbate mental health conditions. I think the emotional distress caused by imprisonment can't be underestimated. But women also did receive meaningful care and support in the prison. Many charities and non-state organisations worked through the prison to provide social support, drug and alcohol rehabilitation, psychotherapy, art and creative therapies, training and employability, and many other services. These services were often a lifeline for women, and the prison was seen by some as a place of retreat from difficult and disadvantaged lives. And after Holloway's closure, many organisations that did important and necessary work through the prison lost their footing in North London and their ability to reach many women. Women end up in prison for all kinds of reasons, largely related to structural disadvantage, to marginalisation and to institutionalised racism. Their crimes tend to be related to poverty and drug use and addiction, and are overwhelmingly non-violent. Women in prison are also very likely to have suffered serious sexual, child, domestic, or emotional abuse before entering the criminal justice system. And it's important to note that being sent to prison tends to exacerbate pre-existing difficulties and vulnerabilities for women. They can be made homeless, they can lose their jobs, and often lose custody of their children when they're sent to prison. So we as a collective believe that spaces of support and care should not primarily be provided through the prison system, that women shouldn't have to go to prison to access services and care, and also that punitive environments are not appropriate for healing and personal transformation. We also insist that it's structural disadvantage and marginalization that need transformation, rather than asking individual women to rehabilitate, despite having extremely limited support and life opportunities. So this is why Reclaim Holloway has advocated since the prison's closure for a women's building as an inclusive, transformative space of support for women in the community in a non-punitive environment. We think the building should be a living legacy for Holloway and the women in prison there. It should represent a shift in direction from the criminalization of women to community-based support and addressing structural disadvantage. It's important to note also that women tend to be vulnerable at very different points in their lives, and that having consistent support in the community, somewhere to turn to, is crucial. Ours is a much more expansive vision for the women's building than what's currently being offered by Peabody, the developers, and designed by AHMM, their architects. Peabody bought the site in 2018 with a 42 million loan and a 39 million grant funding from the Greater London Authority. This is public land bought with public money. And for us, it needs to address the needs of the public and, considering the history of the site, particularly the needs of women. The developers are bound by the council's planning document to provide a base for women's services and a safe space in which multiple services can be accessed in one building. But the developer's vision for the women's building is restrictive and minimal, and it does not sufficiently take into account community and women's sectors' voices. The design, to us, seems to be based on inadequate research and insufficient consultation with the women's services who actually hope to use the building. Importantly, in the draft master plan, the building is currently designed as a ground floor of a residential block, with not at all enough space to offer a home for women's services or create a space for social support. So at that, I'm going to invite our panel members to introduce themselves and to offer some initial questions or some initial reflections. So the question that I pose to each to think about and think through in their initial reflections is to think about a therapeutic women's building on the former prison site. What would a space of healing and support look like for women accessing services through the women's building? So Niki, would you like to go first, please?
Okay, I shall share my screen. Okay, so hello and good evening, everyone. In my day job, I'm an artist, animator, and freelance graphic designer, and I periodically teach art in prisons. For the past 4 years, I've been part of Reclaim Holloway's quest to secure a transformative and iconic women's building on the former Holloway Prison site, and probably the UK's most important historical site in the fight for women's rights. I've been a member of Community Plan for Holloway Board since its inception in 2018. So today I want to share a vision of a trauma-informed therapeutic women's building. Though it is a personal vision, and I'm not officially representing Community Plan for Holloway or Reclaim Holloway today, it shares and reflects much research and many other women's thoughts and experiences. First, though, I want to make something clear. The argument that a substantial women's building will somehow reduce housing on the site is bogus. There is ample room for both. So remember, also, this is a windfall site for Islington. The current plans have more homes than Islington Council's top scoping estimates, and more than the local residents are comfortable with, or many local residents. But once again, women's needs are being sacrificed to some greater good. So many services were lost or dispersed when Holloway closed. At the very least, the women's building must replace those losses. It offers the opportunity that so many reports have been calling for, to actually provide the infrastructure for real change and show that as a society, we care for women and their families. And I'm talking about services for women that can help prevent them from ending up in prison in the first place. And for women who leave prison, having had their identity and confidence stripped from them, and who are expected to pick up their lives again with no help. Services for victims and their families, for all women in the community. But that's the minimum. In the vision I'm going to propose, the Holloway Women's Building will be a place where women feel they can go at any point in their lives, for whatever reason, from support and treatments to learning, skills, empowerment and opportunity. And so here is a schematic plan that I put together last year, after I added up all the space and services that a full vision would require. And ambitious, yes, women are worth it. But whatever is eventually constructed, it needs to be trauma informed. And why? Because many women using the building will be survivors of traumatic experiences. Lazy, intensively conceived spaces and decor can act as a trigger to their trauma. You only have to go to your local probation office to know what I mean. Colour, light, space, furnishings and layout need to be considered carefully. And that's why this London Festival of Architecture session is so important. So what will someone with a history of trauma find when they enter the Women's Building? Let's start with the ground floor. It will be open to the public, engaging and educating visitors with a museum and shop that sells items made in the building, across the site, and by women in general. There'll be a ground floor cafe, a creche so that children can be cared for while appointments are being attended, a multi-purpose hall for fitness, markets, community hire, a memorial garden, and a pharmacy, because walking to the nearest one at Caledonian Road or Nag's Head may be difficult or unsafe for many women who use the building. Okay, now let's take the elevator to the first floor. In our vision, the art department will offer classes and access for the community as well as women only, and therapeutic sessions. Creative facilities were a vital aspect of HMP Holloway. There was a dedicated 350 square metre therapeutic arts facility just for the healthcare wing, as well as art, craft, music, cookery, IT, textiles, ceramics, and other classes in the education department. Women could learn new skills and learn how to express themselves in creative ways, providing innovative forms of therapy and transferable life skills. The art department in the developer's current plans has to share with the creche and the multi-purpose hall. So what does this say? That we want to treat women as children? I mean, this is nonsense. The fundamentals of art therapy require respect, consistency, and opportunity. Art projects can take time, days, weeks, months to complete. You know, it can be extremely distressing to return to your work and find it damaged or lost. No, art therapy is vital and varied. It deserves a full floor. I'll just quickly go through the rest of the floors to give you a flavour of the vision. So moving up the building, we have the general service provider floor. Then we have a specialist service provider floor. And in our vision, this is where the building becomes largely women only. And I'm using women in the most inclusive sense here, based on principles we hammered out 2 years ago. And then moving up, we have a therapy floor. And beyond that, we have an emergency housing floor. And this is all part of a fully networked, holistic vision operating under one roof. So the general service provider floor will provide a wide range of services for women and their families. These services will include an employment centre that helps women find work outside of the normal CV submission procedure, family services, legal advice, and access to remote prison video call visits, which is a lifeline for prisoners and their families. Next, the specialist service provider floor. These services should include services for victim support, young women, and the empowerment of all women, wherever they live. Above that is the therapy floor. This is the floor where the most sensitive service would be delivered. This would include many different types of individual and therapy and services such as probation that could operate flexibly from the space. There would also be a women-only cafe located on this floor, providing a safe and inclusive space for women to meet and relax. Then a floor of short-term emergency housing. For women leaving prison or who are fleeing an abusive situation, the accommodation would be a community of studio flats with a dedicated caseworker who would seek permanent accommodation, as well as guide them through the services that they need elsewhere in the building. I mean, immediate and easy access to services is vital when dealing with traumatic circumstances. Delay and frustration can really compound them. And finally, the roof. The women's building needs to be an iconic and visually stunning. You want to know immediately where it is, not to have to ask which block of flats it's under. I'd like to see a geodesic dome constructed on the roof that can be seen from afar and lit up at night as a beacon to all women everywhere. It's well documented that engagement with nature and green spaces is highly therapeutic and good for mental health. The dome could double as a conservatory where horticulture could be learned, and the space enjoyed more generally with viewing area and outdoor refreshments area. So I have presented many ideas of how an iconic women's building, the legacy building, can be part of this vibrant community and could manifest on this site. In contrast to this generous, trauma-informed vision, what do the council and the developer had in mind? Okay, you can brace yourself. And this is what the current plans look like. It's a single floor beneath 2 residential blocks. It is supposed to be a women's building, yet it is really just a community centre with a paltry approximately 350 square metres of the proposed 1,320 square metres that are actually dedicated to women's services. And I also strongly suspect that the 1,320 square metres includes the 200 approximate square metres of residential core, but I have yet to have this clarified. The space allocated to women's services is split in half, and this means that a woman attending therapy session would have to walk through the general areas to get to the service provider area. I mean, this is a clear example of how a building is not trauma-informed. And there are many creative ways to incorporate the legacy of the prison into this development, but this is not it. Women who have experienced prison do not want to go to a building that reminds them of the prison, with heavy, dark, masculine red brick facade and dominating, brutal, oppressive and controlling entrance. Despite all the research and education and ideas we have put forward, clearly showing that what is on offer is far from inadequate and still less trauma-informed, we're now in a position where the male representative from the council and the male representative from the developer, are telling us that there's no point in continuing the conversation if our demands for more space remain the focus of the meetings. The men have spoken. Community Plan for Holloway's 2-year campaign for more space for women has also been dismissed as just one voice, albeit a big one. Who are the other more important voices than the community? There is no one assigned from the council or Peabody to fight for the women's building. All the major players hold housing as their priority agenda, despite the needs of women having been clearly identified as a key part of the plans. None are experts in women's services. They have not even done a feasibility study or viability study on how the building would function. This clearly shows a lack of due process, bias and discrimination. What they are proposing is a standard community centre operating model, not a visionary building that suits the service providers or the service users. This is making women meet the needs of the building rather than the building meeting the needs of women. And it totally misses the legacy of the prison, and the women who were held there. We have something far more celebratory in mind. The women's building could be such a big win for Peabody and Islington Council. It could bring prosperity, kudos, and a vibrant, sustainable, visionary community. And unfortunately, I suspect they'll say that they are so far down the road that they can't possibly go back. My response, diddums. This is public money. You should have listened to the community in the first place. The only way to resolve the issues around the women's building is to take a step back, talk to the independent experts, look at the services that need to be in the women's building and build it around this premise. To fix a limited space, magically expect all the services to work in it and not re-traumatize women who need it most is fantasy. Realistically, it is better to get this right now than to build a missed opportunity. So thank you, and please sign the petition.
Thank you so much for that, Niki. So inspiring and really moving to watch as well. Like, I think just seeing the plans, the way that you've presented them there, it makes me well up a little bit, thinking like, imagine if this was what we actually managed to achieve at the end of all this. Thank you so much for that. Please do, I see one comment popping up in the chat. Please do put your reactions, questions in the chat as we go. And we will share the link to a petition that we've put together in the last few weeks at the end of this and in a follow-up email. Okay, great. Could we have Yvonne, Professor Yvonne Jewkes next, please? Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Okay, well, thanks, Rachel, very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm Professor of Criminology at the University of Bath and co-director of the Centre for Prisons Research there. And I've been conducting research on prison architecture and design for over a decade now, mostly funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And I've also acted as a consultant to architects on several new prison builds and refurbishments in the UK and elsewhere in the world. The most recent of which was working with the Irish Prison Service on the new women's prison at Limerick. And I wanted to share a little bit of the experience of that because we set out to make sure that it was a therapeutic, trauma-informed design, though obviously it is a prison. Oh, it's not, hang on. So this is the old Limerick prison, the current Limerick prison, I should say, because the new one is still being built. This prison was opened in 1821. And as you can see, it looks it. This is where the women in Limerick are currently living. On the right-hand side there, you can see an empty cell, and that's their living conditions. I persuaded the Irish Prison Service to hold a design competition, and we shortlisted 4 architecture practices. And I don't have time to describe the process in any detail, but my aim was to encourage the architects who are competing for the contract to consider not only how we might radically rethink the way we design prisons for women, to deinstitutionalize them, make them more humane, more therapeutic, and so on, but also actually to change the way that prison staff and wider society view women who go through the criminal justice system. So currently, instead of encouraging autonomy, agency, ambition, and appropriate anger, prison makes children of women, as Niki just said. It infantilizes them through, among other things, its architecture and aesthetics, also its perpetuation of misogynistic stereotypes, and its failure to nurture any ambitions for a different kind of future. There are 2 exemplars that I often show prison architects, which I think could be useful for thinking about the women's building at Holloway and how it might be therapeutic. One is the unbuilt HMP Inverclyde in Scotland. The prison wasn't built for good reasons, but it was going to be built on a large footprint, again echoing some of what Niki just said. So to allow plenty of freedom of movement, and it was designed to have the look and feel of any other kind of civic building. a shopping mall, an airport lounge, even a hotel. And a large proportion of the budget was to be spent on attractive landscaping, to include horticulture and animal husbandry. Also a standalone family help hub near the main entrance of the prison offered a welcoming and supportive environment for visitors and users, and provided them with access to social services, charities and third sector organisations. There was to be a dedicated mother and family garden, combining therapeutic design and planting with areas of activity and play, and a multi-faith contemplative garden providing outdoor space for spiritual and personal reflection. The second exemplar I often show prison architects is Maggie's Cancer Care Centres. This is the Maggie Centre in Oldham. It's another biophilic design, emphasising the healing power of nature, also of soft materials, tulip wood in this case, of natural daylight and curves as opposed to straight lines, long corridors and sharp corners. So these are the kinds of designs that I showed the architects who were competing for the Limerick Women's bid. And we went through the whole process and we ended up choosing PJ Hegarty Architects. And this is the design that they came up with. Much like the women's building at Holloway, they were working actually in the end on a very restrictive site. It's a small footprint. So we had to do what we could given those restrictions. But you can see they took on board my message about landscaping and mature trees. This is the association space in the living accommodation. Again, some of the design cues, particularly from Maggie's Centres, have been built, incorporated here. So curves, maximum exploitation of natural daylight, and as de-institutionalized and trauma-informed as possible. This is the visiting spaces with outdoor play area for children. This was a very early prototype. I don't think the bedrooms will actually look quite as Spartan as this, but you know, at least again, you can see that it's quite a far cry from the sort of medieval catacombs that the women in Limerick are currently living in. So I'm quite proud of this design and my input into it. I believe it will make a real difference to the lives of women in prison in Ireland. But I wanted to say two things in particular. First, I've met very few female architects on new prison commissions, including for women's facilities. I was going to use the phrase missed opportunity as well. Of the 4 consortia who competed for the Limerick contract, there wasn't a single woman amongst them. So no women commissioners, planners, contractors or designers. And that's one of the reasons why it's so good to be invited to be part of this panel and part of the whole Reclaim Holloway event. Secondly, as feminist criminologist Beth Ritchie says, behind each socio-cultural problem, domestic violence, drugs, poverty, and so on, stands a woman with a history of narrowing options. The compounding impact of multiple subjugations and stigmatized identities, she says, leads to the incarceration of a population of women who have experienced such a profound concentration of the most vicious forms of economic marginalization, institutionalized racism, and victimization that it can almost seem intentional or mundane. And I think, you know, the women's building is an opportunity to start opening up the options and opportunities for the women who use it. I've recently written something on the feminist prison, which is an oxymoron. But one of the things that I've argued is that we lack ambition and aspiration for women. And in the context of the Holloway redevelopment, I think that calls for an ambitious and aspirational building. I think the Therapeutic Women's Building will not only be a safe, secure and welcoming space, but it will aspire to greater social mobility for women, to give them a long-term path out of abuse, harm and narrow horizons. And why shouldn't a therapeutic approach be grounded in feminist political philosophy? Offering women a wider range of opportunities and something to be passionate about would give them a different form of protective capital. not the kind of survival capital that's learned through poverty or prison, but the economic capital that provides them with long-term independence, and the social capital that comes from positive interactions and experiences that bring joy and give confidence. For me, therapy is not just about psychotherapy and counselling, important as those are, or even about access to nature and green spaces, though I've written quite a lot about that. It's about things like dance, music, debates, fashion shows, theatre, art, as well as art therapy and indeed art history. I was talking to a friend recently who's a former senior prison psychologist, and she said to me, women need to learn new skills where possible from each other, including how to grow stuff, cook stuff, serve as a car, fix stuff, be independent from the men that abuse them. They need to learn critical thinking so that they can fight the patriarchy when they have to. They need community. And I think if the Women's Building can offer something that allows its users to grow and to grow in confidence, to put fire in their bellies, as my psychologist friend said, the therapy and healing happens around the edges in the million small unplanned events, interactions and conversations. You can't program this stuff in, she said. It just happens in the gaps. So I think that what the Women's Building should be designed to do is give space for dynamic things to happen at the edges and in the gaps. It should be an ambitious and aspirational project, and it should be ambitious and aspirational for the women who use it.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Yvonne. There's so much in that. I don't even know where to begin, but I love this idea of building a space of aspiration for women as well as somewhere expansive. And I think this notion of women teaching each other things in community and allowing space within this building for that to happen is just amazing. And yeah, I wanted to flag at this point as well that the next of our events next Monday night is about structural inequality in construction and architecture, where we address this point about the lack of female input into these buildings. And thanks for raising that as well. That's fantastic. Nisha, would you like to go next, please?
Sure, yes. So I've put together just really quickly at the beginning a few slides about who I am, where I'm from. So my name is Nisha Kurian, I'm an architect, and I'm an associated practice called We Made That. So we're an architecture and urbanism practice, and we operate with a kind of very strong public conscience. All of the work we do is public, so we work a lot with the public sector, numerous councils across London, but also with kind of third sector and charity organizations. The work that we do is not just about kind of architecture, it falls under 3 strands. So we do urban research, we also develop area strategies and kind of master plans for larger areas. But then we also deliver kind of built projects, so that's kind of architecture and public realm. But as I said, you know, all of the work that we do is underpinned by a very, a kind of very strong weighting towards community engagement and being engaged with the kind of people in the places that we're working with. So I've just kind of put 2 examples on here. The one on the left is a project that we did in Kensal. And one of the things that we find quite often with these kind of projects, public projects, especially ones at a certain scale, it's very difficult for communities to kind of engage with something that might be more strategic or less kind of tangible than delivering, you know, a building, for example. And also there are groups that are harder to reach who are typically less involved as a part of that conversation of how you shape what gets developed and what gets delivered. So on the left in Kensal, for example, we always look for these kind of creative and meaningful ways to engage with these harder to reach and underrepresented groups and communities. So this was working with young people to develop a podcast where they explored the idea of kind of how you engage with the built environment in your neighborhood and the kind of change that's happening around you that you feel so not quite in control of. Similarly, on the right, it's a project that we did up in Wealdstone. It's the Wealdstone Youth Workshop, where young people got actively kind of involved in that engagement process. And it was a process to deliver a public space, Wealdstone Square. And they designed a kind of piece of furniture that would be used in public spaces around the area. So that's very much the kind of crux of the sort of work that we do, this very kind of engaged process. I also wanted to quickly talk about a program that we've initiated recently, which is called Reset Go. And again, this is about trying to identifying that architecture is quite a white and kind of male profession, and how do you increase diversity and kind of include more underrepresented groups into that profession. Is looking at kind of pathways and ways to get young people into the profession. So that's just a really quite quick kind of overview into what we're about as a practice. And I wanted to speak a bit more about this project and the kind of concept of a women's building on the former Holloway site, and also just thinking about how this should manifest. As you might have guessed from that kind of initial intro, because of the way that I work, I think I'm as interested in sort of the built outcome, so what it's like and kind of what it provides, as I am in the process of kind of getting there to that built outcome. And by this I mean, so the development of the kind of design for the new building and how this can be, effectively co-authored and co-developed with the participation of people. So that's starting with, potentially people who were incarcerated there or elsewhere. So learning from their experience, also speaking to people who live nearby and the people who would kind of ultimately end up using it. I feel that's all kind of very important, for a project that's significant. I also think the idea of how a women's building could sort of honor the legacy of the previous prison is really an interesting topic, and also incredibly complicated, as it's got to address both this kind of symbolic, the sort of historical and psychological perhaps, as well as this pragmatic dimension of what you're actually delivering here. And how can what's delivered here be kind of therapeutic or healing in its subsequent incarnation? So it was this place that, it was many things, but it was also a place that offered, as Rachel said at the beginning, essential services and care to women in need. And I think on a pragmatic level, that sets your kind of minimum benchmark in terms of what should be provided. And kind of Niki's gone on to speak, really quite inspirationally about, the ambition that you can set for something here and what you can build upon in terms of the kind of positive aspects of the previous version of it and what can be expanded. And I suppose that sits on this kind of pragmatic dimension camp. So building on these kind of services and delivering a new women's building, which offers those resources and facilities that would benefit both women in the kind of immediate area, but also further afield, should definitely be center stage of this legacy. And I think, delivering a vibrant and active women's center that serves to improve the lives of women and, in turn their communities is fundamental here. But there are quite significant and kind of serious questions that also need to be answered about kind of how do you fund this? Like, who are those partners that you can partner with to help deliver this vision? What are the actual services and the uses? What is the kind of brief for the building in terms of both spatial typology, but also the kind of uses required? What's the business plan for its kind of ongoing operation? These are the kind of questions that need to be embedded into the sort of brief for what this new building can become. And having this kind of good, robust brief for the building, spaces delivered need to respond to those kind of types of uses that need to be delivered there, and understanding the types of uses to be delivered is kind of should be underpinned by community engagement. So like understanding that local need. So this process requires kind of engagement with the community, proper research and consultation, and importantly, reaching out to all sections of that community. So particularly those harder to reach and more vulnerable groups who aren't typically well represented, say during a design development or planning process. And so this needs to be developed in consultation with those future potential inhabitants. That's the organizations, the service providers, the service users, as well as the wider local community. And I think that collective dialogue, that kind of discussion and exploration of these issues can begin to kind of become healing in a sense. So the way I look at it, it's more than a question of kind of, is it a standalone building or not? I'd kind of go back to my point about a good project brief, and how you create a kind of civic presence and represent the kind of importance of a building or a facility like this can be handled in a number of ways. I think it's really about accommodating that scale, and as well as kind of intelligent urban design and strategic spatial thinking, making sure that those community facilities are integrated. So integrated community facilities and mixed-use developments have their benefits and can be wonderful things, but the key is kind of creating these neighborhoods that feel both inclusive, safe, and accessible. And there are innovative and exciting ways of delivering a project like this. But again, I think a good brief starting point is the key, a project brief, to help, to help design this final facility, and making sure that it's that design development is co-developed in as engaged and inclusive a way as possible. So for the women's building, I think creating inclusive, welcoming, and generous social spaces that feel accessible to women of all backgrounds and their families, community facilities and kind of social infrastructure benefits women generally, and kind of helps increase, give them more independence and consideration to these more kind of convivial public areas within the building, thinking about what parts require more privacy on the other hand, as Niki, you were saying, in that kind of vertical structuring of the building, a public realm surrounding the building that makes women feel safe, and that's kind of knitted into the fabric of the city, that's legible and easy to navigate around in terms of finding your way around, but it's also accessible in terms of kind of making your way around it. Say if you're pushing a buggy or less mobile, something that's clean and safe and has facilities for you. All of this requires kind of both an understanding of spatial typology, but also kind of urban design. And I think that's where this interaction with the kind of master planning architects is really crucial, because it isn't just about kind of a volume at the bottom of a shape. You want to be influencing the urban form and the kind of way that this is organized at a more strategic level. But then at the same time, ideas of kind of affordability and rental levels and the kind of ongoing running of this building is also incredibly important to consider. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Nisha. Again, so much to respond to there. That yeah, very rich. I think this notion of conviviality is a very appealing one. Thinking about the women's building being embedded in the locality and being a space for everybody in the community, but particularly addressing the needs of women. And I think what you're saying in terms of the process being a healing process, and a process that will, really create a building that is meaningful for women and for the wider community as well, is something that we really feel has been missing from the consultation process so far, which has been very unilateral, and I think has been poor in terms of the work that you described at the very start of really reaching out to the community and reaching hard to reach groups. So I think it's a massive issue from what we can see. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay, and finally we'll come to Kate Paradine from Women in Prison, and we will hope to keep a few minutes for questions at the end. So if you do have questions, pop them in the chat. But otherwise, Kate, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rachel, and I'll keep things short so that we can have some questions. And thanks, Nisha. I think you might have my dream job. It sounds like an amazing job, and that was a brilliant presentation. And thanks to Yvonne and Niki as well, and Rachel, for all the work that you're doing on Reclaim Holloway. It's so important. And every time that I come to events like this, I remember how much time I'd like to be spending doing things like this, because it's such an important piece of work. So the legacy of Holloway, well, Women in Prison is the organisation that I work with. I'm CEO of Women in Prison, and we work with women in prisons and also in communities through women's centres in London, Manchester, and also in partnership with others in other parts of the country. And our role is to really build the case for a world where we don't need women's prisons. And so in our community-based services, we aim to model a model of justice that doesn't involve prison. Now, up until January, we were making quite good headway with that in terms of the work that the government had done in terms of a strategy for reducing women's imprisonment. But completely unexpectedly, in January, the government announced that there will be 500 new prison places for women at a cost of £150 million. And ever since then, we've been trying to find out exactly what modelling went on to lead to this decision. And unfortunately, we've not been able to find that information. And we understand that it's something to do with there being 20,000 new police officers, which for us begs the question of what police officers these new police officers will be doing and who they will be bringing into the criminal justice system if we need 500 new prison places for women. Because as was said at the beginning of this, the vast majority of women in prison are there for very minor poverty related offending linked to the root causes of offending, like substance misuse, mental health, and other issues like domestic abuse. So it really is a bizarre situation we find ourselves in. And when I was looking at the Limerick prison, Yvonne, and I agree with you, a lack of ambition and aspiration is at the heart of imprisonment, really. And I thought the Limerick prison, when I looked, I thought it looked like it could be a women's centre. And it got me to thinking there about, imagine if every prison would be affected by these new prison places, the money went to a local women's centre to either be built, but more especially to be renovated, because most women's centres are in churches, they're on disused high street shops, in spaces where people are making good. So I think we could do a lot worse than to think about the way we regenerate our spaces. Now, to think about the services that might be hosted in the Holloway Women's Building that Niki imagines is to imagine a future that is quite beautiful for women's services and for women. Women's services are scattered across London. Many of them are national and international organisations of great renown. And now that we are in this position where COVID means that we're very rarely getting together, the spaces to gather are going to become more and more important. And so we feel that a women's building in that spot could be an amazing place where meetings and gatherings of women's organisations, including some flexible space for work to take place, could be an amazing use of that space. I loved your dome, Niki, but also the green space and all the ideas around kitchen space for women to cook together. At work at Women in Prison, we've been baking on Zoom through necessity as part of our sort of team building, which has been an absolutely lovely experience. And we think you could do a lot with cooking in terms of building connections across partnerships and with women we work with. So I think there is so much that could be done if only those that have the power to do so will look ahead in a visionary way, like Niki and Nisha and others have been doing. Because if we were to do that, that would be a legacy that I think we could all be proud, a legacy that the chance of which will never come again. In terms of healing and welcome, there are fewer things that I can imagine more welcoming and healing for women who have experienced trauma than a space where other women welcome them. And we see that all the time in women's centres. It's not so much the services that are provided, whether it be around jobs, mental health, or other therapeutic services that we provide, but about connecting with other women and about connecting with women that have different lives to you, and some of them have very similar lives to you. And it's that connection that we think that the women's building could really represent. And that's that seeking of nature, the green space that Niki spoke about, in contrast to what is proposed. So we are all for the idea that the women's building should model a Niki type design. In terms of Holloway, I just to end on a reflection of my first time in Holloway was making Christmas cards with some of the women that we were working with. And it really struck me that when we came with the various materials, how excited the women were with the gold letters like that you write your name with. And I was so struck by it, and I still remember it, because to me it represented infantilization that Yvonne spoke of, that actually epitomizes everything that is wrong with the criminal justice approach to change and punishment. And the infantilization of women is what has resulted in the system that we've got now. So for us, I would like to think about a system and a women's building that represents that system, that is all about your assets, your ambition, your aspiration, about healing and therapeutic approach to change, that represents something quite different to what we've got now. So thanks for giving me the time, Rachel and team, and yeah, look forward to some questions for our last few minutes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kate. So if you do have questions, do pop them in the chat. I was really struck, yeah, with this notion. I mean, it's central to abolitionist thinking, really, that it is a political decision where the government spends money. Do you invest it in imprisonment, in criminalization, in policing, or do you invest it in community spaces and think about what causes crime in the first place? What causes the social harm that tends to lead to crime? But yeah, and I'm really struck as well by this notion of, again, learning from women, being with women, sharing experiences. And I wonder if the rest of the panelists would be happy to reflect on what they think spaces of collective healing in the building would look like, whether that's through, you know, the kind of activities that would happen there, or through the architectural design principles. If you'd like to offer a couple of seconds, because we're coming up on 8 o'clock, but if you'd each like to offer some reflections about that, that'd be great.
I'd love to see an art gallery, Rachel. There's so much amazing art that comes out of women's prisons, and yeah, that would be wonderful.
We have a question. May I read the question?
You can read it and respond to it as well if you'd like to.
Yeah, are the current plans for the women's building trauma informed? Was there any research done? And I think the answer to that is a resounding no. I mean, I brought up at a meeting just this week that the facade was not trauma informed and very trauma triggering, and that the placement of the rooms was completely ineffectual. And it wasn't until another voice came up and said, actually, you know, we really do have to consider the trauma and sport formed aspect of it, that people started listening. So I think it's a little bit of a new concept to them, but I think that the actual research that was done for this was based very much on other women's centres, and it wasn't really looked at what the services from Holloway actually were and how they would be replaced in a new and transformative way. It was just, you know, the original plans from the council, I see them as just, you know, a very nice version of existing women's centres. There wasn't any real sort of strategy behind it or anything. And that's why I think a different approach is needed. And I love your call for a new brief. Brilliant.
Thanks, Niki. Yeah, I think it's really important to think about not only, yeah, that it's a trauma-informed building, but the particularity of the legacy of Holloway, and thinking about this site as a particularly significant site for women's history, for women's rights, and thinking about it, as you say, like a space of hope and aspiration that can be a change in direction rather than just doing the same thing all over again.
Try
Nisha and
something
Yvonne,
new
would you
for
like
a
to offer any
change.
reflections?
You know, we have to just try something new. Everything's the same. No, just shake it up and try something bold and new. You know.
I totally agree.
I'm not going to speak too much because I'll just end up in a tirade. Please have some more questions.
I was just going to say, Nisha and Yvonne, would you like to offer any reflections about this notion of like what the space would look like if it were a place of collective healing for the women who will use it.
Well, I just wanted to say, I agree with the call for something bold, because I think part of the problem is that we don't think outside the box, literally. And you know, again, it goes back to what I was saying about ambition and aspiration. I think we're far too ready to think this is good enough for women who've been through the criminal justice system, or this is good enough for, you know, the women that will use this space. And actually, you know, we should be reaching much further than that, and also consulting with the users of this space. You know, that doesn't happen nearly enough. Certainly never happens in the world of prison architecture. You know, prisoners are not asked for their opinions. And, you know, again, just to endorse what Kate just said about the Christmas cards, when I showed pictures of the architect's renders of Inverclyde to the women in Limerick and also at the Jewkes Centre in Dublin, they were completely blown away by them. You know, they just gasped and said, "That's the nicest room I've ever seen. That's nicer than my bedroom at home." And I think, you know, we're trying to provide something for women who have had really awful, often chaotic lives, and, you know, they just deserve something much better than you know, they're being given currently. And, you know, as has been said, most of them are, I mean, 1 in 3 women are in prison for shoplifting. You know, it's not the hallmark of a civilized society, the way our criminal justice system is currently formed. So yeah, I think we should be thinking about light, bright, open spaces. Something like an exhibition space would be fantastic, but also spaces where performances can be held, you know, all the kinds of things that I was talking about, really. Just advocate for that.
Amazing, thank you. Any final thoughts, Nisha? And then we'll have to bring things to a close, I think.
I think just one, also just, I think somebody mentioned it about the historic significance of this site, and, you know, it is another aspect that needs to be considered, because it was like the first women's prison in the country. I mean, if this was about, say, industrial heritage, it would get a lot more, you'd see a lot more importance given to it in terms of kind of in planning terms and in terms of what's being reprovided and how you're kind of honoring the legacy of what was there. So it's, yeah, it's, I mean, it's like, what is a modern version of what the prison used to be in terms of focusing more on the rehabilitation and community side of things and providing services. That should really be something that underpins the brief, I guess, for this new building. And that needs to come from a consultation with the people that are going to use it.
Absolutely. I think that's such a point, you know, which histories are remembered and in what ways, like whose voices are incorporated into the national story, I guess, that it can be celebrated through these sites, these significant sites. Thank you all so much for your participation. We've had a bit of a flood of questions now, just as we are wrapping up, I'm afraid, so we're not going to be able to get them, but please do feel free to follow up with us as Reclaim Holloway, and we can put the questions. I think a lot of them that have been posed are better directed toward the developers, actually, rather than in this space. So we'll definitely make sure to collect those questions and to make sure that we put them to the developers to hold them to account. So thank you all, Nisha, Niki, Yvonne and Kate, for taking part, and thank you to everybody who's attended. I just want to quickly flag the final panel discussion in the series that we're hosting as part of London Festival of Architecture, which is next Monday evening. And we'll be talking about issues of structural inequality in the architecture and construction industries, and thinking about Holloway as a site that could and should be a model of equitable development. I'd also like to point you toward our website and Twitter account, which I will now pop in the chat. So these are the asks that Reclaim Holloway are putting forward to the developers. We want an extensive public and women's sectors consultation and an independent feasibility study. We really want the history and the legacy of the site to be embedded in the design principles. And we want the developers to look at design options that offer a more innovative and iconic solution than one that's currently being put forward. And as we'll focus in particular next week as well, thinking about a procurement strategy that prioritizes women-led businesses all the way through. And I'll also pop up the QR code for the community plan for Holloway petition, which we'll also send to you by email after this event. So thank you very much for all your participation and for the amazing and inspirational contributions from the panelists. We'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much.